This video is part 2 in a 2-part series. You can watch part 1 by clicking the link on the top right of your screen. The year is 1906. The Russian Revolution has been crushed. The RSDLP has failed. Now the regime is cracking down on the revolutionaries. But as we'll soon see, defeat is the best teacher. Lenin and the Bolsheviks won't make the same mistakes next time, if there ever was a next time. In April of 1906, the Fourth Party Congress, sometimes called the Unity Congress, was held in Stockholm. At its center was the issue of land reform. This was particularly important to Russia's peasants, who the democratic socialists failed to appeal to during the First Revolution. You see, due to being a centuries-old feudal autocracy, most of the land in Russia was owned by aristocrats, leaving little to the land-hungry peasants. The Bolsheviks argued for the radical solution of having peasant committees take over and redistribute the land by force, while the Mensheviks proposed the reformist solution of having the Russian government hold the land and allow the peasants to work on it. But this being the Unity Congress, neither side was willing to go nuclear, so they just compromised. The other main benefit of the Unity Congress was that it brought the Polish and Lithuanian Social Democrats into the party, adding tens of thousands of new members to the RSDLP. But in spite of the success of the Unity Congress, the years 1906 to 1910 were a bad time for Russian socialism. Many of the exiles lived in intense poverty, while Lenin's own health was failing him. All of this was made worse by silly mistakes and infighting. During the First Russian Revolution, the RSDLP refused to participate in the Russian Duma. This made sense at the time because a revolution was imminent, but now, during a time of stability, they were still boycotting it. The party was also flat broke, forcing it to resort to robberies for funding. It was during this time that the party gained a new rising star in the form of a young Georgian calling himself Stalin. Luckily, the situation would change in 1910. The year 1910 saw a major economic recovery in Russia. As the nation's fortunes improved, so too did those of the RSDLP, with new members flooding in. The Bolsheviks gained the lion's share of them, and eventually felt strong enough that they chose to stop working with the Mensheviks. By April, the Bolsheviks had completed their preparations to launch a new paper, choosing to call it Pravda. This wasn't the first RSDLP paper to go by that name. Trotsky had run his own Pravda years earlier, but Lenin and Trotsky still hated each other, with Lenin even trying to prevent Trotsky's old Pravda from gaining official status within the party. But in spite of that, the old Pravda was very successful, so the Bolsheviks saw nothing wrong with exploiting its good name. This upset Trotsky considerably, but since he wasn't a Bolshevik, he couldn't do anything about it. Like its predecessor, the new Pravda was a tremendous success, with a first print run of 60,000. The government, naturally, tried to censor it, but the Bolsheviks confounded the censors by changing its name to things like Workers' Pravda, Labor Pravda, and Northern Pravda. It was during this period when the Bolsheviks were able to finally fix their finances, while the RSDLP corrected years of mistakes by finally joining the Duma, using its investigative powers to expose as much government corruption and incompetence as possible. By the early 1910s, the international socialist movement started to notice the increasing military tensions across Europe. So in 1912, they held the Basel Emergency Conference of the International. This was a massive show of solidarity of international socialism, with 555 delegates representing 23 countries. It was here, and at other conferences, where they all agreed that in the event of war, the working class should take the opportunity to overthrow capitalism. In the lead-up to the First World War, there was an increasing amount of communist activity across Europe, causing the RSDLP to experience explosive growth, especially among young people and women. Women were paid special attention to, getting their own pages in Pravda dedicated to their issues. But in the lead-up to the war, the Russian government began to crack down, shutting Pravda down in July of 1914, and arresting as many Bolsheviks as possible. But then, an even greater disaster hit: World War I. By now, you know the drill. Crackdowns, exile, and the underground were the order of the day. But something was different this time. Because during World War I, the Bolsheviks were not only attacked by the forces of reaction, but by their own leftist allies. All around the world, the forces of international socialism turned coat and supported the war. They told the workers to stop striking and to join the army so they could murder each other. By the second half of 1915, the patriotic fervor gripping Russia started to die down, replaced by the harsh reality of losing the war. As food prices rose, the workers returned to strikes and protest. In 1916, the situation was even worse. The value of the ruble was being destroyed by the government, who printed so much of it that there was an 8-fold increase in the ruble supply. And as more men were forced into the army, women were made to replace them in the factories. The Bolsheviks held a conference for the anti-war internationalists in Zimmerwald, but it was so poorly attended that Lenin joked, "You can put all the internationalists in the world into 2 stagecoaches." While the conference itself didn't accomplish much, it made Lenin world famous for his anti-war writing. While not intended by either man, both Lenin and Trotsky had the same exact anti-war stances. This key issue would cause Trotsky to begin his transition into a Bolshevik. And then, it was 1917. The situation in Russia was worse than ever. There were hundreds of thousands of strikers in January alone. Shortages of supplies brought major factories to a standstill, while the food shortages were worse than ever. And the Russian people were being made to endure all of this in the name of a war that they weren't even winning. They had finally had enough. The Russian Revolution was about to begin. On the 18th of February, 30,000 workers of the giant Putilov factory began to strike. The owners responded with a lockout, but that turned out to be a terrible mistake because it forced the workers onto the streets. By February 23rd, International Women's Day, this single factory strike turned into a broader movement that clashed with police. By the 24th, more than half of the city's workers, 200,000 people, were on strike. On the 26th, soldiers were ordered to fire into the crowds, but some refused and even joined the workers by firing on the police. Finally, the peasants, who staffed the military, were joining the revolution. The Mensheviks, in charge of the recently reformed Soviets, chose to collaborate with the liberals. This was popular with the workers, who were not yet fully radicalized. So on March 2nd, the Provisional Government was set up. It was largely led by constitutional Democrats, Octoberists, and landowners, all with the support of the Mensheviks and their Soviets. Just like during the last Russian Revolution, these events caught the Bolsheviks completely by surprise, so they were unable to exploit any of it. From outside Russia, Lenin attacked this strategy of class collaboration in his famous Letters from Afar, before finally moving to Petrograd to take charge directly. With assistance from the Germans, Lenin arrived in Petrograd on April 3rd. He was then taken to the fashionable residence of a famous ballerina, where he was regaled with warm and loving welcome speeches. When they finished, Lenin rushed to take the floor, where he immediately denounced the revolutionaries for collaborating with the liberals. In spite of all this agitation, Lenin led the Bolsheviks in a surprisingly conservative strategy. They opposed immediate violent revolution, and argued against protesters when they tried pushing the slogan, "Down with the Provisional Government." The first revolution had taught the Bolsheviks what happens when you rise up too soon. Instead, they focused on growing the party and educating the masses. Their slogan was "Patiently Explain." Because of their caution, the Bolsheviks and other leftist parties were able to gain tens of thousands of members and not get crushed by the government. None of this means that they weren't preparing for revolution, though. The Bolsheviks assisted the Soviets in creating armed militias, but nearly everything was lost in July. On July 3rd, in response to news that more soldiers were going to be sent to the front, Petrograd's soldiers, sailors, and workers initiated an uprising. But it was poorly coordinated and lacked leadership. Still focused on growing the movement, the Bolsheviks tried to stop them. The July Days, as they would come to be called, were a failure for the same reason as the Moscow uprising during the last revolution. A single city rising up on its own was just too easy to concentrate forces against. But the Provisional Government then went a step further and blamed the whole ordeal on the Bolsheviks, even accusing Lenin of being a German spy. Which, while an exaggeration, had some truth to it. He was being assisted by the Germans. Not long after that, the Provisional Government collapsed, allowing Alexander Kerensky to assert full control, and issuing a warrant for Lenin's arrest on July 6th. At first, Lenin thought about complying, believing that a trial would be an excellent opportunity to grandstand, but he was convinced by the party that it would be better to go into hiding. Meanwhile, Trotsky, who was still not a Bolshevik, wrote a letter to the government accusing them of hypocrisy. He said that since he believed pretty much everything that the Bolsheviks did, it was hypocritical to arrest them and not him. The government agreed with this assessment and arrested Trotsky too. It now seemed to everyone, including Lenin, that Bolshevism had been defeated. A pessimistic mood took hold. But they were all wrong. While their leadership was wrecked, the party itself was still growing. Meanwhile, Kerensky's armies were losing at the front, making him very unpopular with the Russian people. This would all lead to a unique opportunity. In July, General Kornilov, who would go on to found the Southern Russian White Movement during the Civil War, was appointed Supreme Commander of the Provisional Government's armed forces. On the 25th of August, communications between him and Kerensky broke down, prompting Kornilov to march on Petrograd. Kerensky was forced to denounce Kornilov and turn to the Bolsheviks and other leftist groups for help. All of the Bolshevik leaders, including Trotsky, were released from prison. The Bolsheviks were decisive in defeating Kornilov, cutting off his communications, stopping and misdirecting his trains, and once the army was halted, sending in agitators to convince the troops to stand down. The Bolsheviks even sent a delegation of Caucasian Muslims who were attending the Soviet Congress in Petrograd to address Kornilov's Foreign Savage Division in their own language. Kornilov's march ended in failure, almost entirely thanks to the Bolsheviks. So now, with their popularity soaring and their leadership free, the Bolsheviks were stronger than ever. These events radicalized the Soviets, causing their members to vote for Bolsheviks to lead them across the country. In the first week of September, the Petrograd Soviet fell firmly into Bolshevik control. The Soviets in Moscow, Central Siberia, Finland, Estonia, and the area around Petrograd follow. It should be noted, however, that this was largely an urban phenomenon. The Bolsheviks were still weak in the countryside. That same month, Lenin began bombarding party leadership with letters demanding they organize an insurrection. One was so blatant that the Central Committee felt they had to burn it. However, Lenin didn't actually want to begin the insurrection immediately. Rather, he knew that the opportunity was coming and wanted the Central Committee to be ready for it. Eventually, Lenin returned to Petrograd disguised in an actor's wig. In August, the 6th Congress was held. It was here when Trotsky finally joined the Bolsheviks and was elected to their Central Committee. He even came bearing gifts in the form of thousands of new members from the Mezryanka faction, a group within the RSDLP who were slightly more radical than the Mensheviks, but not quite as radical as the Bolsheviks. By this point, the party's membership could be measured in the hundreds of thousands, which, while massive, still wasn't enough to carry out an insurrection on its own. So Lenin and Trotsky argued over when they should overthrow the government. Lenin wanted to do it immediately, while Trotsky wanted to wait until after the upcoming Congress of Soviets where they could vote to legalize the insurrection. Eventually, they agreed to do the revolution at the same time as the Congress. This would prove to be the greatest decision of their lives. On October 19th, or the 1st of November on the regular calendar, a secret meeting of the Central Committee voted to initiate the uprising. Unfortunately, some members protested this decision by publicly writing articles about it. This should have been a disaster, but incredibly, no one did anything about it. So on the night of October 25th, or November 17th, Bolshevik forces, led by Leon Trotsky, seized every key government building in Petrograd with virtually no resistance. In fact, the revolution was almost bloodless. By the end of the day, everything except for the Winter Palace was in Bolshevik control. It's impossible to overstate what a complete and total victory this was for Bolshevism. They just took over one of the most powerful countries on Earth practically without firing a shot. This was not just a testament to their massive popularity, but to the complete and utter decrepitude of the Russian state. It was so weak, so pathetic, and so unpopular that no one was willing to defend it. Russia was now, officially, red. Trotsky then held an emergency meeting of the Petrograd Soviet to announce that the Provisional Government had been destroyed. Then, Lenin, disguised as a worker, revealed himself to the committee and gave his own speech. The next day, as the Winter Palace was being secured, the official meeting of the Congress of Soviets was held. There, the Bolsheviks won majority control of the Soviets and created the Soviet government. One of the world's only two superpowers had just been born. But Soviet Russia wasn't a superpower yet. In fact, there was a very real chance of it dying in its infancy. The Russian nation they now ruled over was starving, poor, and still at war with the Central Powers. Meanwhile, new enemies were gathering in the form of the Russian White Army and their allies in the Entente. This conflict would come to be known as the Russian Civil War. Luckily, we already have videos on the Russian Civil War, which you can check out via the links on the top right of your screen. Because this has been the history of the Bolsheviks. This video was funded by an alliance of international socialism to destroy capitalism and bring about the communist utopia, including Josiah. Links to everything can be found in the description below this video. Like, comment, and subscribe for more. I'll see you in the next one.